Tonight, we uncover a story buried beneath centuries of faith, a rivalry older than any religion, and a secret that may change everything we think we know about divine power. They say the walls of Rome hold every secret, but some are buried far deeper, beneath flagstones worn smooth by the footsteps of cardinals, beneath crypts where incense still lingers from masses said centuries ago, beneath the very foundations of an institution that has outlasted empires, plagues, and the ambitions of countless kings who thought themselves destined to rule forever. You find yourself standing in the cool darkness of an autumn evening, somewhere in the early 14th century, though the exact year matters less than the feeling in the air, that electric tension that precedes storms both meteorological and political, and you can smell wood smoke drifting from distant chimneys, can hear the soft shuffle of monks completing their evening prayers, can sense that something monumental is about to unfold, even though the streets remain quiet, and the stars above twinkle with the same indifference they have always shown to human drama. This story you are about to experience stretches across continents and centuries, involves kings and popes and knights and bankers and peasants and scholars and torturers and saints and sinners, and I must warn you with the gentle affection of someone who has walked these shadowy corridors many times before, you probably won't survive this, at least not without your eyelids growing heavy, and your breathing slowing to that peaceful rhythm that signals the boundary between wakefulness and dreams. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you are settling in, perhaps adjusting your pillow or pulling your blanket just a little higher, I would love to hear where you are listening from tonight, whether you are in Tokyo watching the sun rise, or in London watching it set, whether you are in Buenos Aires or Brisbane, or some small town whose name appears on no map, but which holds everything dear to you. Please share your location and local time in the comments, because it genuinely warms my heart to know that these stories travel so far. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The question that draws us into the shadows tonight is deceptively simple, the kind of question a curious child might ask between bites of dinner, yet it has occupied historians and conspiracy theorists and novelists for over 700 years. Why did the Church fail to destroy the Knights Templar? And before you object that the Church did destroy them, that Pope Clement V officially dissolved the order in 1312, and that the last Grand Master Jacques de Molay was burned at the stake in 1314, I invite you to consider what we mean by destruction, because organizations are curious things, less like buildings that can be demolished, and more like ideas that can be suppressed, but never truly erased, and the Templars, for all the Church's efforts, refused to disappear in the way their enemies intended. You breathe slowly as we travel back to the beginning, not the beginning of the Templars themselves, which would require us to journey to Jerusalem in 1119, when a small group of knights pledged to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land, but rather the beginning of their downfall, which conventional history places on Friday, October 13th, 1307, a date so infamous that some historians argue it created our modern superstition about Friday the 13th, though scholars continue to debate whether this folk belief actually predates the Templar arrests or emerged much later as a kind of cultural aftershock, and the answer honestly depends on which dusty archive you choose to trust. King Philip IV of France, a man whose nickname Philip the Fair referred to his handsome appearance rather than any commitment to justice, because medieval nicknames were nothing if not superficial, had accumulated debts to the Templars that would make a modern credit card company weep with sympathy. And he also harbored a deeply personal resentment toward the order, having once applied to join their ranks and been rejected, which just goes to show that even medieval rejection letters could have world historical consequences. On that infamous Friday morning, Philip's agents executed simultaneous dawn raids across France, arresting every Templar they could find, a logistical achievement that required months of secret planning and coordination, the medieval equivalent of a synchronized military operation. And if you think coordinating a surprise birthday party is difficult, imagine trying to arrest thousands of heavily armed knights across an entire kingdom without anyone leaking the plan, because medieval France apparently had better operational security than most modern governments. The charges against the Templars read like a fever dream compiled by someone who had consumed too much ergot-contaminated rye bread, which was actually a genuine problem in medieval Europe and may have contributed to some rather creative accusations throughout history, because the list included spitting on the cross, worshipping a mysterious idol called Baphomet, engaging in obscene kisses during initiation ceremonies, and various other offenses that seemed designed more to shock and titillate than to accurately describe any actual practices. Here is your first mainstream historical fact for this section. Documented extensively in the trial records preserved in various European archives, Pope Clement V, who was supposed to be the supreme spiritual authority in Christendom, and therefore the Templars' ultimate protector, was essentially a puppet of Philip IV, having been installed in the papacy, largely through Philip's political machinations, and this uncomfortable reality meant that the one institution that should have defended the Templars was compromised from the very beginning, a bit like hiring a fox to guard the henhouse, and then being surprised when feathers start appearing everywhere. Now for something a bit more peculiar, the kind of tidbit that makes history feel less like a dusty textbook and more like a conversation with an eccentric uncle. Some medieval chroniclers reported that on the night before the arrests, several Templar ships allegedly departed from the port of La Rochelle, loaded with mysterious cargo, and were never seen again, their destination unknown, their contents unrecorded. And while this could simply be the result of normal shipping activities or creative embellishment by later writers, it has fueled centuries of speculation about hidden treasure, secret documents, and emergency escape plans that suggest at least some Templars saw the storm coming. You feel your muscles relaxing as we consider how strange it is that an order of warrior monks, men who had fought and died defending Christian territories in the Holy Land, who had developed sophisticated banking systems that allowed pilgrims to deposit money in one country and withdraw it in another, essentially inventing the traveler's check several centuries early, could be accused of the very heresies they had spent their lives combating. The accusations against the Templars were so extreme, so cartoonishly villainous, that some historians have wondered whether Philip and his advisors overplayed their hand, creating charges so ludicrous that they undermined their own credibility, a medieval example of what we might call prosecutorial overreach, though of course the Templars themselves, subjected to torture in French dungeons, were in no position to appreciate the irony. Imagine yourself in one of those dungeons now, not as a prisoner, but as a spirit drifting through stone walls, observing the flickering torchlight that casts dancing shadows across rough-hewn blocks, smelling the damp earth, and something metallic that you prefer not to identify, hearing the distant drip of water that marks time more reliably than any clock, and understanding that in this moment, the fate of thousands hangs in the balance while the men who hold that power sleep soundly in beds far more comfortable than anything these prisoners will ever know again. The Church's problem, and it was a significant one that would prove decisive in the long run, was that the Templars were not simply a French institution that could be crushed by a French king. They were an international organization with chapters and holdings across every Christian kingdom in Europe, from Portugal to Poland, from Scotland to Sicily, and while Philip could arrest the French Templars, he had no authority over those in other countries, many of whose rulers were considerably less enthusiastic about persecuting men who had committed no obvious crimes within their borders. You drift through walls of ancient stone, through corridors where torchlight never quite reaches the corners, and you begin to understand that this story is not simply about guilt or innocence, not merely about religious persecution or political ambition, but about something more fundamental, the limits of institutional power when confronted with an organization that has become too useful, too wealthy, too deeply embedded in the economic and military infrastructure of an entire civilization to be simply erased. The whispers begin, as whispers always do, in the spaces between official pronouncements, in the hesitations of cardinals who should speak but remain silent, in the nervous glances exchanged by merchants who have done business with the Templars and now wonder whether that association will damn them as well. You find yourself floating through the great cathedral of Notre Dame, not the one that exists today, but its earlier incarnation, already ancient and magnificent, where the rose windows filter autumn light into pools of crimson and gold that spill across stone floors, worn smooth by generations of feet seeking salvation, and you can hear the murmur of prayers rising like smoke toward vaulted ceilings, so high they seem to touch heaven itself, though perhaps that was the point, to make humans feel small enough that they might remember their place in the cosmic order. The accusations against the Templars spread across Europe with a speed that seems remarkable for an age without telecommunications, carried by messengers on horseback, by merchants traveling trade routes, by pilgrims who had heard rumors in one town and repeated them in the next, each retelling, adding new details, new horrors, new impossibilities, until the original charges became almost unrecognizable beneath layers of embroidery and speculation, a medieval game of telephone that would be amusing if the stakes were not so terrifyingly high. Philip IV had made a calculated gamble in arresting the Templars, betting that Pope Clement would support his actions despite the irregularity of a secular king imprisoning members of an order that answered only to the Pope, and for a time this gamble seemed to pay off, with Clement issuing the bull Pastoralis Praeeminentia in November 1307, ordering all Christian monarchs to arrest the Templars in their territories and seize their assets, a document that transformed a French persecution into a continent-wide crisis and demonstrated just how thoroughly Philip had compromised the papacy. But here is where the story becomes interesting, or rather where it becomes interesting to those of us who appreciate the subtle ways in which great plans can unravel. Because while many European rulers dutifully followed the papal command, arresting their local Templars and confiscating their properties, the enthusiasm for this enterprise varied dramatically from kingdom to kingdom, ranging from zealous cooperation to what we might charitably describe as strategic foot-dragging. Your mainstream historical fact for this section comes from the records of Edward II of England, Philip's son-in-law, who despite family pressure proved remarkably reluctant to persecute the English Templars, initially refusing to torture them as French inquisitors demanded, and eventually conducting trials that produced almost no confessions of wrongdoing, a stark contrast to France, where torture had produced a steady stream of damning admissions that happened to confirm exactly what the prosecution wanted to hear. In Portugal, the situation was even more peculiar, with King Denis simply renaming the local Templars as the Order of Christ and allowing them to continue operating under a new banner, a bit like a company declaring bankruptcy and immediately reopening under a different name, which probably annoyed Philip tremendously, but left him with no practical recourse. You breathe slowly, feeling your chest rise and fall with the rhythm of centuries, as we consider the role that Templar wealth played in both their persecution and their survival, because the order had become over 2 centuries the most sophisticated financial institution in medieval Europe, operating a network of preceptories that functioned as banks, warehouses, and military staging grounds, managing the assets of nobles and kings, who trusted them more than they trusted each other, and accumulating property holdings so vast that some historians estimate they may have controlled as much as 1/8 of all the arable land in France, a statistic that makes Philip's interest in their dissolution seem considerably less theological and considerably more fiscal. The quirky historical tidbit for this section involves the infamous treasure that supposedly vanished before the arrests, because medieval chroniclers and modern conspiracy theorists alike have speculated about what the departing ships from La Rochelle might have carried, with suggestions ranging from the mundane, such as financial records and liquid assets, to the spectacular, such as the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, the head of John the Baptist, or documents proving that Jesus had fathered children. And while we might smile at these more extravagant theories, we should remember that the Templars had access to Jerusalem for nearly 2 centuries, and that medieval people took relics very seriously indeed. Scholars continue to debate whether the Templar banking system actually contributed to their downfall by making them indispensable creditors to kings who preferred not to repay their debts, or whether their financial sophistication simply made them a convenient scapegoat for broader economic anxieties in a period when Europe was transitioning from a primarily agricultural economy to something more complex and money-based, a debate that mirrors modern discussions about whether being too big to fail is ultimately a protection or a vulnerability. You drift through the counting houses where clerks once tallied figures in neat columns, through treasuries where gold coins gleamed in the light of oil lamps, through archives where documents recorded every transaction with the meticulous precision that characterizes institutions expecting to exist forever, and you feel the weight of all that accumulated wealth pressing down on these spaces like something physical, something that could be touched and counted, and crucially coveted. The irony of the Templar prosecution is that while the official charges focused on heresy and apostasy, the actual seizure of assets proceeded with far greater efficiency than any theological investigation, with Philip's agents cataloging properties and confiscating valuables while the trials were still ongoing, as if the verdict were a foregone conclusion and the legal proceedings merely theatrical flourishes designed to provide moral cover for what was essentially an enormous heist. Imagine yourself in the chamber of a French inquisitor, the air thick with the smell of old parchment and fresh fear, where a man who once commanded hundreds of soldiers in defense of Christendom now stands accused of crimes so absurd he cannot quite believe he is expected to answer them seriously. And yet the instruments of persuasion arranged on the nearby table make clear that seriousness is very much expected. The torture methods approved for use against the Templars were the standard repertoire of medieval interrogation, including the rack, the strappado, and various applications of fire, and the confessions they produced read like scripts written by the interrogators themselves, which is essentially what they were, because people being tortured will generally say whatever they believe will make the pain stop, a fact that modern psychology confirms and medieval inquisitors either did not understand or did not care about. You feel your body sinking deeper into whatever soft surface supports you tonight, your eyelids perhaps growing heavier as we consider the human cost of these proceedings. The men who were broken in body and spirit by interrogators, asking impossible questions about crimes that existed only in the imagination of their accusers. The knights who had served faithfully for decades, only to find that their service counted for nothing against the political ambitions of a greedy king and a weak pope. The families left behind who would never understand what had happened or why. But amid all this darkness, something remarkable was happening that would ensure the Church's ultimate failure to destroy the Templars. The order was becoming a legend, a symbol of something larger than itself, a mystery that would prove far more durable than any mere organization could ever be. Across Europe, people began to whisper, not just about Templar crimes, but about Templar secrets, not just about their guilt, but about their hidden knowledge, not just about their destruction, but about their survival. And these whispers would grow over the centuries into a cultural phenomenon that shows no signs of diminishing even today, 700 years later, which suggests that while Philip and Clement may have won the battle, they were destined to lose the war. The trials drag on for years, which is perhaps the first indication that things are not proceeding as smoothly as Philip and Clement had hoped, because if the case against the Templars were as clear-cut as the initial charges suggested, surely it would not require 7 years of hearings, depositions, papal commissions, and ecclesiastical debates to resolve. And yet here we are in 1311, with the Council of Vienne convened specifically to determine the order's fate, and even now there is no consensus among the assembled bishops and cardinals about what should be done. You find yourself settling into a comfortable drowsiness as we explore this council, held in the French city that gives it its name, where delegates from across Christendom have gathered in a setting of extraordinary architectural beauty, with Gothic spires reaching toward autumn skies, and cloisters where hushed conversations determine the fate of thousands, and you can smell incense and candle wax and the particular mustiness of old ecclesiastical vestments worn by men who take their wardrobes very seriously. The mainstream historical fact for this section concerns a remarkable moment of resistance that occurred during the council, when a delegation of 7 to 9 Templars, depending on which source you trust, suddenly appeared to offer a defense of the order, having somehow traveled to Vienne despite the arrests and confiscations, and their presence so alarmed Clement that he suspended the council for several days while trying to figure out what to do with these inconvenient witnesses who threatened to disrupt the carefully managed proceedings with their insistence on due process. This moment captures something essential about why the Church failed to destroy the Templars. The prosecution's case was fundamentally weak, relying almost entirely on confessions extracted under torture, and whenever conditions approached anything resembling a fair trial, the whole edifice began to wobble like a poorly constructed tower of alphabet blocks, which is precisely what happened when Clement allowed some French Templars to recant their confessions, leading Philip to respond by burning 54 of them as relapsed heretics in a single day, a massacre designed to discourage further recantations through the simple expedient of murdering anyone who attempted them. Your quirky historical tidbit for this section involves the mysterious figure of John de Chalon, a Templar sergeant who testified that the order had been warned about the impending arrests by someone close to the king, possibly even by the king's own confessor, and that several senior officials had managed to escape France before the trap closed, a claim that raises fascinating questions about who might have sympathized with the Templars within Philip's own court, and why they would have risked royal displeasure to provide such a warning. Scholars continue to debate whether the confessions extracted under torture contain any kernel of truth about actual Templar practices, with some historians arguing that the initiation rituals probably did include some unusual elements that could have been misinterpreted by outsiders, while others maintain that the confessions are entirely fabricated, manufactured by inquisitors working from a predetermined script, and the truth probably lies somewhere in the murky middle ground where all interesting historical controversies reside, frustrating our desire for clean answers while keeping the conversation lively. You drift through the corridors of Vienne, as if carried by gentle currents, past bishops arguing in corners, past scribes copying documents that will one day fill archives in Paris and Rome and Vienna, past servants who understand nothing of the theological debates but know enough to stay out of the way when powerful men disagree, and you feel the peculiar sensation of witnessing history being made, while simultaneously understanding that those making it have no idea how their choices will be judged by future generations. The Council of Vienne ultimately did what councils do when faced with difficult decisions. It compromised. issuing a series of documents that dissolved the Templar order without actually convicting it of heresy, a legal distinction that may seem like hair-splitting, but actually made an enormous difference, because dissolution without conviction meant that individual Templars, who had not been personally condemned, could potentially receive pensions and live out their days in relative peace, and it meant that the order's reputation, while damaged, was not officially and permanently destroyed. Pope Clement, caught between Philip's demands for complete annihilation and the reluctance of many bishops to condemn men on such dubious evidence, chose a middle path that satisfied no one completely, but allowed everyone to claim partial victory, which is perhaps the defining characteristic of papal diplomacy throughout the ages. Because when you are trying to maintain authority over all of Christendom, you quickly learn that total victories are rare and usually counterproductive. Imagine yourself in the papal chamber where Clement drafts the bull Vox in excelso, suppressing the Templar order, not because it has been proven guilty, but because it has become so notorious that it cannot continue to exist without scandal, a remarkable admission that the legal case has failed, even as the political necessity of dissolution remains unchanged. And if you listen carefully, you can almost hear Clement sighing as he affixes his seal to a document he knows history may not judge kindly. The transfer of Templar properties to the Knights Hospitaller, mandated by the bull ad provatum, proceeded with varying degrees of efficiency across Europe, with some regions seeing smooth transitions and others seeing decades of legal disputes as various parties claimed pieces of the Templar patrimony, and in the end, much of the wealth simply disappeared into the coffers of kings and nobles who were supposed to be merely holding it in trust, a bit like asking a child to guard a cookie jar and then being shocked when the cookies vanish. You feel your breathing deepening as we approach the most dramatic moment in this long saga, the execution of Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, who had confessed under torture in 1307, recanted his confession before a papal commission in 1308, and then spent 6 years in prison while the various trials and councils determined his fate, a period during which he presumably had considerable time to reflect on the choices that had brought him to this point, and the choices that still lay ahead. On March 18, 1314, de Molay was brought to a platform erected in front of Notre Dame Cathedral to hear the sentence that had been predetermined by Philip and Clement, life imprisonment, which was actually relatively merciful by medieval standards, and might have allowed the elderly Grand Master to end his days in a comfortable monastery cell rather than a dank dungeon. But de Molay, in a moment that would ensure his legend far more effectively than any military victory could have done, stood before the assembled crowd and recanted his confession once again, proclaiming the innocence of the Templar order and declaring that he had only confessed to avoid the torture that he knew awaited those who maintained their innocence. Philip, furious at this public repudiation of the entire prosecution, ordered de Molay burned at the stake that very evening, on a small island in the Seine called the Ile des Juifs, and tradition holds that as the flames consumed him, the Grand Master summoned both Pope Clement and King Philip to meet him before God's tribunal within a year, a curse that gained considerable credibility when Clement died just 1 month later, and Philip followed in November, though skeptics might point out that medieval rulers died frequently from various causes, and the timing, while dramatic, may have been coincidental. The manner of de Molay's death transformed him from a defeated administrator into a martyr, from a political prisoner into a symbol of resistance against tyranny, from a historical figure into a mythological one, and this transformation would prove far more damaging to the Church's interests than any outcome of the legal proceedings could have been, because you can suppress an organization, but you cannot suppress a story, especially a story featuring prophecy, courage, and divine judgment against the powerful. The official story ends here, with the order dissolved, the Grand Master dead, the properties distributed to other hands, and the Church's victory seemingly complete. Yet even as the ashes of Jacques de Molay cool on that small island in the Seine, something else is beginning, something that will frustrate the intentions of Philip and Clement far more thoroughly than any military resistance could have achieved. You find yourself in a strange transitional space now, neither quite in the 14th century, nor entirely in the present, floating through the centuries that follow the Templar suppression and observing how the order refuses to die in the ways its enemies expected, refuses to fade into the comfortable obscurity that should be the fate of all dissolved organizations, refuses to become a mere footnote in ecclesiastical history when it could be a source of endless fascination instead. The mainstream historical fact for this section concerns the survival of Templars in various guises across Europe, most notably in Portugal, where the Order of Christ continued Templar traditions under a new name and would eventually fund the voyages of exploration that made Portugal a global maritime power, with some historians arguing that the distinctive cross on the sails of Portuguese explorers was a direct descendant of the Templar cross, carried to new continents by men who considered themselves heirs to a tradition that the Church had tried and failed to exterminate. In Scotland, where King Robert the Bruce had been excommunicated, and therefore felt no particular obligation to obey papal bulls, Templars fleeing continental persecution allegedly found refuge, and some traditions claim they fought at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, charging the English lines at a crucial moment and turning the tide of battle, though this is one of those stories that sounds better than it can be documented. Your quirky historical tidbit for this section involves the emergence of Templar legends in popular culture, beginning almost immediately after the suppression and continuing unabated for 7 centuries, including claims that the Templars discovered the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, the bloodline of Jesus Christ, the secrets of ancient Egyptian magic, the location of Atlantis, the mysteries of the Freemasons, the origin of Swiss banking, and practically every other puzzle that has ever captured human imagination, a catalogue of supposed Templar secrets, so extensive that if even a fraction of them were true, the Order's archive must have been the most remarkable document collection in human history. Scholars continue to debate the extent to which Freemasonry actually derives from Templar traditions, with some researchers arguing for direct organizational continuity through Scottish lodges that preserved medieval practices, others suggesting that early Freemasons simply adopted Templar symbolism because it sounded impressive, and still others maintaining that the entire connection is a romantic fiction created in the 18th century when mysterious origins became fashionable, a debate that will probably never be resolved because both Templars and Freemasons are quite good at keeping secrets, if indeed there are any secrets to keep. You drift through the centuries now, watching the Templar legend grow and mutate, adopted by romantic poets who saw in de Molay's death a symbol of artistic martyrdom, by revolutionaries who found in the Templar persecution a precedent for resistance against tyrannical authority, by novelists from Walter Scott to Dan Brown, who discovered that readers never tire of stories featuring warrior monks, hidden treasure, and ancient conspiracies. The Church's failure to destroy the Templars can be measured in many ways. In the Templars who escaped to Portugal and Scotland and helped shape the futures of those nations, in the Templar traditions that may or may not have survived in fraternal organizations, in the Templar wealth that enriched kings and nobles rather than the institution that claimed it, but perhaps most significantly in the Templar myth that has proven utterly impervious to dissolution. You feel yourself settling deeper into comfort as we consider what this failure tells us about the nature of power, because Philip and Clement had at their disposal all the apparatus of medieval authority: armies, inquisitors, dungeons, stakes, papal bulls, royal decrees, and the seemingly infinite resources of both French crown and Roman Church. Yet even with all these tools they could not make the Templars disappear, could not erase them from history, could not prevent their story from becoming more compelling with each passing century. The very extremity of the persecution guaranteed its failure, because moderation leaves no memorable stories while excess generates legends. And there is something almost comic about the disproportion between what Philip and Clement achieved, which was the legal dissolution of a single military order, and what they inadvertently created, which was a myth that has spawned thousands of books, hundreds of films, countless conspiracy theories, and a permanent place in popular imagination that most historical organizations would envy tremendously. Imagine yourself standing on the Ile de la Cité in Paris, where Notre Dame still rises though changed by recent fire, where the Seine still flows past ancient stones, where tourists walk streets that medieval Templars once knew, and consider how strange it is that we are still talking about these warrior monks, 700 years after their supposed destruction, how their symbols still appear on everything from video games to whiskey bottles, how their story still generates passionate debate among people who will never agree on what actually happened. The Church failed to destroy the Knights Templar because you cannot destroy a story by burning its tellers, cannot erase a legend by disbanding its subjects, cannot suppress a mystery by declaring it solved, and because the very attempt at destruction generates the conditions for immortality. As you settle into the final stages of wakefulness, breathing slowly and deeply, feeling your body grow heavier with each passing moment, consider this final thought: the Templars may have lost their buildings and their wealth and their organizational structure, but they gained something far more valuable and far more durable. They gained our attention, our imagination, our endless fascination with their fate, and in that sense they are more alive today than many organizations that never faced any persecution at all.